Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Burges Watson, and coming up on today's programme, European leaders and the Ukrainian president meet in Paris in a bid to up the pressure on President Vladimir Putin after he vowed that Russia will fight on in Ukraine. We ask, what's been agreed there in Europe and what are their options? Plus, Israel estimates that its imminent offensive on Gaza City will displace 1 million Palestinians. We'll get the latest on the humanitarian situation on the ground, as well as the latest as Israel continues its deadly bombardment of the Palestinian enclave. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Paris, where European leaders gathered today for a summit with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Well, under discussion, security guarantees for Kyiv in the event that a peace deal is struck, ending Russia's 3.5-year-long war against the country. Well, following on from their talks, the so-called Coalition of the Willing held a video conference with US President Donald Trump. Well, that summit was co-chaired by the French President Emmanuel Macron and the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Sir Lyall Grant, who is a former UK ambassador to the United Nations and a former UK National Security Advisor. Sir Mark, thank you very much indeed for joining us once again.
Good evening.
We were just talking there about how the Coalition of the Willing, which is of course a group made up of about 30 nations, has been meeting in Paris. It's a mostly European collection of nations, but there is also Canada, Australia and Japan. Are they all looking and sounding united, would you say?
I think the Europeans and those other countries you mentioned are pretty united, Tom, yes. What they're trying to do is two things, really. One is to reassure Ukraine that the financial and military political commitment is there and will continue as long as it's necessary, but also trying to send a message to President Trump that the Europeans are now paying their way, they're stepping up to the plate, they're carrying the burden, but America is required, in particular as some sort of safety net to any security guarantees that are agreed as part of an eventual peace deal.
Okay, we heard from a Downing Street spokeswoman earlier today saying Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer thinks it's necessary to, quote, go even further to apply pressure on Putin to secure a cessation of hostilities. I mean, when you hear people talking about applying more pressure on President Putin, what sort of things spring to mind?
Well, essentially, the Europeans are producing a lot of sanctions against Russia. They're now using and seizing some of the Russian frozen assets and using that money to support Ukraine. But the reality is that they need the Americans to actually put both political and economic pressure on Russia. Now, the Europeans this week are being very polite about President Trump, but I think privately they'll be very concerned at the fact that there's been no follow-through in reality to the Alaska summit, that was seen as a success for President Putin, and all the sort of pressure that was building up on Putin in advance of that summit has now dissipated. And Putin is looking quite sort of confident that if he doesn't get what he wants on the negotiating table, he'll secure it militarily.
Indeed, and that's what we heard from him in Beijing, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. But clearly, the attacks on Ukraine are continuing. President Putin appears to have been, using certain delaying tactics, and that's presumably why President Macron says that the question now is, quote, the sincerity of Russia. He also said that, he seemed to be suggesting that President Putin was playing President Trump. Do you agree with that assessment?
100%, yes. I mean, it's quite clear that Trump has been played by Putin very successfully for the last 7 months or so. Putin has been playing for time, gaining ground on the battlefield, and hasn't shifted 1 inch really from his maximalist demands. He repeated most of those again this week. So President Putin was once demanding there'd be a ceasefire and said if Russia didn't agree to that, then, sanctions would be ramped up. If that happened within 10, 12 days, that didn't happen. We had the Alaska summit, and Putin said he didn't want a ceasefire, he wanted an eventual deal, and President Trump appears to have agreed with that. So I think Putin has negotiated extremely successfully against President Trump, who now looks rather weak in his search for a settlement in Ukraine.
And just with regards to security guarantees for Ukraine, we heard from a Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman today saying that Moscow would not entertain the deployment of foreign troops in Ukraine in any format. That being the case, what sorts of security guarantees can be provided?
Well, that's a slightly different line from what other Russians have said in the past, and it's just a sign that, President Putin is ramping up his demands rather than reducing them or compromising on them. But the reality is that if there are some security guarantees, it will involve some troops, and indeed some troops from NATO countries. Not Americans, I'm sure, under President Trump, but nonetheless there will be Europeans. But any security guarantee for the future sovereignty and independence and freedom of action for Ukraine will require some American involvement. Now, whether that safety net is in the form of Patriot missiles or, civilian Americans mining on the ground, etc., has yet to be worked out. But I don't think any security guarantees provided only by the Europeans will be sustainable in the longer term.
Do you think we might see a change of approach now from President Trump, given, as we've been saying, that it's starting to look as though, to many leaders, President Putin's been playing him, to use President Macron's words? I mean, do you anticipate President Trump saying, right, enough is enough, we've done our best, we're now going to turn up the temperature?
Well, I would hope so, Tom, but I'm not confident, to be honest. I mean, we would have said the same thing a month ago. That he appeared to be changing his rhetoric, saying he was getting frustrated and fed up with Putin as Putin intensified his attacks on Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine. But he hasn't followed through. And for whatever reason, he seems very reluctant to increase the pressure on President Putin.
And President Putin, as you were just saying a moment ago, looking and sounding pretty confident. We saw him in Beijing, very much at top table there earlier in the week. And he's been hailing his troops' progress in Ukraine, saying that Russian troops are advancing on all fronts, he says. Although the British Defence Secretary, John Healey, saying he doubts that. What's your opinion? Do you think President Putin is slightly inflating his achievements on the battlefield?
Well, he's certainly inflating his achievements, but equally it's clear that he is making very slow progress at a massive price. We shouldn't forget that Russia's lost over 1 million soldiers killed or seriously maimed, and he's relying increasingly on North Korean soldiers, even some Chinese mercenaries now, to continue this fight. But nonetheless, he is making slow progress, but he's not going to achieve his original aims by just continuing this war indefinitely. That's clear. So yes, he can appear confident, but I think under the surface, Russia is still in quite a vulnerable position.
Let's turn our attention to China for a moment, where, as I was saying just a moment ago, we saw President Putin with President Xi and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. That seemed to be sort of the Kodak moment from that particular day of celebrations in Beijing. I mean, some are saying that really was a show of challenge to the sort of US-dominated world order. I mean, how rattled do you think Western leaders were seeing those scenes in Beijing yesterday?
I don't think they would have been particularly rattled, although President Trump himself seems to have been stung into a reply on social media. I think you're right that President Putin appeared on the top table, but he appeared in a very subordinate role to President Xi, because I think what we've seen in the last week, not just the military parade and those three particular leaders, but China hosting the 25th summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and by far the largest of those 25 summits, representing 25 leaders, 43% of the world's population. That is a clear demonstration of Chinese power and authority. It demonstrates China's sort of dominant position in the bilateral relationship with Russia. It sends a clear message to America and the West that this is a new alliance, an Eastern alliance, if you like, led by China, with big ambitions to create a new world order. Now, the rhetoric is much greater than the reality. There's huge differences between all these different countries. So I think there's probably more rhetoric than reality in sort of an emerging world order. But these leaders are united by an opposition to American hegemony and opposition to the sort of established rules-based international order that was built up after the Second World War.
We spoke to a prominent Chinese commentator yesterday on this program who says that Beijing wants peace with the world. Its show of force yesterday was really about, peace through strength. He also said that China had been proactive in trying to broker peace in Ukraine. I mean, do you agree with that assessment?
No, I don't think China has helped the situation. I mean, the one thing that President Xi did do right at the beginning of the conflict is warn President Putin off using tactical nuclear weapons, and that was a valuable role. And indeed, China has not directly provided Russia with frontline ammunition and offensive weaponry, as other countries like Iran and North Korea have done. But nonetheless, they have helped to end the isolation of President Trump and given him a lot of economic support by buying oil from Russia when Europe stopped buying Russian oil. So yes, they've been supportive politically, but they haven't really weighed in military terms. And I think behind the scenes, Xi is rather embarrassed at this conflict. And President Putin is ashamed that he hasn't been able to achieve what he thought would take 3 days in 3.5 years so far.
John, what do you think the collective West's approach to China should be? More isolationist, a bit like what's been given to President Putin, or more engagement? Which do you think is the right way forward?
I think you need a bit of both. I mean, I think there needs to be a degree of containment and protection of our interests from China, both in security terms and economically, but equally there needs to be some engagement with China. China is the second largest economy in the world, and Britain and other European countries certainly need to engage with China. So I don't think we're looking at an isolation strategy. And even President Trump actually wants to do a trade deal with China, because he knows how much the United States depends on China in the same way that, China depends on the United States. So they have a mutual interest in reaching some sort of economic and trade deal. And that's presumably why he has imposed secondary sanctions on India. Tariffs, high tariffs, 50% tariffs, because India is buying Russian oil, but has not done the same to China, which is buying even more Russian oil.
Yeah, and angering India in the process. We've spoken to several Indian leaders this week who've expressed grave irritation. I mean, clearly that show of force in Beijing yesterday had multiple audiences, and we saw all that weaponry on full display, robotic dogs and all sorts of intelligent and autonomous bits of weaponry on full display. I mean, do you think one of the target audiences was Taiwan?
So yes, I think, we know that President Xi has set this theoretical deadline of 2027, by which time he wants his military to be capable, at least, of taking Taiwan by force if necessary. But he would clearly want to avoid that if possible, and to smother Taiwan economically, and so that reunification happens on his watch, but without a military battle. Because one of the lessons President Xi will have learned from Ukraine is that, going up against a well-defended, well-motivated, smaller country is not straightforward. And in military terms, an amphibious attack on Taiwan is actually more difficult than what Putin faced in invading Ukraine. So, and also bear in mind that unlike the Russian army, the Chinese army has had no recent military experience. I mean, the last war they fought was against Taiwan back in the 1970s, and they didn't do very well then. So, it's an inexperienced army, and I think President Xi would be very cautious before launching a full-scale operation against Taiwan. But he certainly wants to achieve reunification on his watch, and he thinks there are other ways of doing it. And this sort of demonstration of military power is a way of, trying to weaken the resolve of the Taiwanese and make, split divisions within the political leadership in Taiwan.
And one of the other target audiences from yesterday's parade was clearly people in other countries, people like you and me, who presumably were watching that display. And I wanted to ask you for your sort of personal view, because I've read that you've met some of the characters in question. You've met President Xi, you've met President Putin. I don't know if you've met Kim Jong-un as well. You have to tell us. But
I haven't met him, no.
You haven't met him. But what went through your mind, knowing the modus operandi and the characters of those individuals, having met them, some of them, not all of them we've established, but what went through your mind when you saw them standing shoulder to shoulder yesterday?
Well, I was struck by the demonstration of the change in the balance between Russia and China. Even as short a time ago as when I was at the United Nations, 10 years ago or so, Russia was very much a dominant political force, even though China's economy had surpassed Russia's, many years earlier. At least there was a balance where Russia produced the sort of natural resources and the military might, and China had the economy and the population. But that balance has completely gone because Russia's military might has shown to be something of a paper tiger. Their economy has got very, very weak now. The economy is only 60% the size of the United Kingdom. It's about the same size as Spain. It's very narrowly based. They've got a stagnant population. So, Russia is a declining power in that sense, whereas China is absolutely on the rise. Now, one should overestimate it because the other aspect that's important to recognize about China is although it's been a spectacular economic success and they're building up their military, as we saw this week, Xi is not without problems. The economy has got more sluggish. There's been this property crisis, a very high youth unemployment. And whereas economists, as recently as 10 years ago, were suggesting that China's economy will overtake America's, some even said by 2028, that clearly is not going to happen. And there's some doubt about whether China's economy will ever overtake the United States, given their aging population and inability to bring in migration in order to boost the labor market in the longer term. So I think China does have some serious problems ahead of it, but you're also struck this week by the progress that has been made in the last 20 years in China.
Okay, and just to wrap up our conversation and to sort of turn our attention slightly back to Ukraine, we heard on Wednesday President Trump saying he remains committed to a Russia-Ukraine peace deal. He says, I think we're going to get it all straightened out, he said. Do you share that same sense of optimism?
No, absolutely I don't, because we've seen nothing either in public or in what I have heard about the Alaska summit and some of the private discussions that President Putin has been prepared to compromise on some of his demands, which are completely unacceptable both to Ukraine, but also to the Europeans. And I think there is a danger that President Trump is so keen to get a deal and be seen as the peacemaker that he will try and compromise on Ukraine and European essential interests. And if he does that, it isn't going to be sustainable. And so I'm not at all confident that it would all be sort of straightened out, certainly in the near future. I do think the conflict will come to an end, though, probably at some point this year. but I don't think it's going to happen in the next few weeks.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Sir Mark Lyall Grant. Thank you very much indeed, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, turning our attention to Gaza, where fresh deadly Israeli strikes have hit western Gaza City. Well, the latest bombardment, which targeted the Zaytun, Sabra and Shajaya districts, is forcing more Palestinians from their home, although thousands are continuing to defy Israeli evacuation orders. Well, Israel's campaign to seize Gaza City is drawing global international condemnation. Well, one senior Israeli military official says 1 million Palestinians will be displaced, but that a new humanitarian area is being created for them. Well, most of Gaza's more than 2 million people have already been displaced at least once during this nearly 2-year-long war. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates has warned Israel that the annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank would constitute a red line and would severely undermine the spirit of the Abraham Accords. Well, this comes after the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, called on Prime Minister Netanyahu to extend Israel's grip over the West Bank. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Jonathan Fowler, Senior Communications Manager for UNRWA, who joins us now from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure talking to you, Jonathan. We've received reports of further ground and airstrikes on Gaza City in the last few hours. Are you hearing anything more about what's been happening on the ground?
I mean, we have colleagues working on the ground. It's very difficult to have contact with them. Contact is erratic, but I mean, all the indicators are that the situation is just sort of spiraling and spiraling. The direct humanitarian impacts, you know, I mean, these are beginning as well. I mean, it's just like worsening an existing situation, which was already, quite frankly, apocalyptic.
Yeah, I mean, what is going to be the humanitarian impact of this new Israeli campaign to capture all of Gaza City? What are you forecasting?
I mean, you know, it's always difficult to predict the future, but sadly, we've seen over and over in this war that, you know, the population, the civilians bear the brunt. You know, the huge numbers of people who've been killed, the huge numbers of people who are injured. And there's also the context, of course, that this is a population who've been starved. You know, a total blockade on aid for months, and then a trickle of aid being allowed in by the Israeli authorities since May. So these are people whose coping mechanisms were already, you know, completely frayed, and Gaza City and its surroundings are in a famine situation. So on top of this, now we have forced displacement orders, hundreds of thousands of people who are expected to pick up, go somewhere else. And their survival mechanisms, I mean, there's nothing left. It's like it's very, very hard to describe, but you know, it just feels that this is like sort of a new layer of awfulness.
Yeah, I mean, it's believed that hundreds of thousands of people live amongst what's left of Gaza City. I mean, ruins by the looks of things from the pictures. I mean, and as you say, horrific conditions, limited food, I presume limited access to clean water as well. And yet, a lot of those people are defying evacuation orders. Why do you think that is?
Well, one thing is that, you know, forced displacement at the point of a gun is completely unacceptable under international law. There is no obligation on civilians to move out of a zone just because they're ordered to. I mean, that's a fact. Now, you know, one can assess or not the wisdom of people's choices, but let's not forget that the population of the Gaza Strip has been displaced multiple times. So the people in Gaza City, I mean, these are people who came back during the ceasefire from January to March, including my own colleagues, you know, to try to locate the rubble of their homes, look for the remains of relatives, sadly, under the rubble. You know, I mean, it's a question of rebuilding or trying to rediscover what held them to their previous life. Now, there's also no place that is safe. I mean, we've seen over and over in this war that when people are forcibly displaced to you know, unilaterally declared safe zones, those zones are anything but safe. People get killed there too. So in a way, it's a rational choice born out of a very, very dark and pessimistic experience, which is, you know, so defiance Yes, I mean, it may be considered that way, but it's also about the fact that people have no options.
Sure. And so when you hear an Israeli commander saying people who evacuate from Gaza City will be relocated to, quote, humanitarian areas for displaced people from Gaza City, it doesn't sound like you think that will give you or indeed the people in question any optimism at all.
Absolutely not. I mean, if we sort of scroll back to last year, I mean, there was the same thing, this unilaterally declared humanitarian zone in inverted commas in Mawasi, which is basically beachside, no infrastructure, nothing for people to live in. Now, if people are driven to areas which are either rubble or have no infrastructure at the same time that the authorities are not allowing in anywhere near a sufficient amount of shelter material, I mean, how does that work? I mean, that's the big question. You can't just declare that people have to go, and then if they don't go, that's their fault. It's also about the fact that international humanitarian law places certain requirements on all parties, and I want to emphasize all parties to a conflict. And one of those things is not to forcibly displace the population. And indeed, the aid structure which has been put in place by the Israeli authorities is also pretty dysfunctional. And so there's no guarantee that if people go to these places where they're being ordered to go, they'll get what they need anyway.
Indeed, but it has been, maybe it just hasn't been reported adequately in the news, or perhaps the information isn't getting out. But it's been a few weeks since we heard about a major incident at one of the GHF food distribution points. Does that suggest they're getting better at distributing aid, or is it just not being reported when there is a violent incident?
I mean, there have been subsequent reports. I mean, the question is, how does one judge major? I mean, any life lost in and around an aid distribution center is a tragedy, and it's something that shouldn't happen. So, if 3-4 people get killed, either on their way to these few distribution points or in the vicinity, that may not make headlines in the same way as dozens, for example. The problem there, of course, is, I mean, we're also, this folds into the fact that the distribution points from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they're insufficient in number. The whole structure is flawed, and the amount of aid that's being allowed in anyway through them, or indeed through, a trickle in through some international organization, it's just not enough. It's not enough. And aid is supposed to go to where people in need are as well. And that's a basic principle of humanitarian law.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, it's been a couple of weeks since we heard Tom Fletcher, the UN Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief. He declared a famine there in Gaza. Has that declaration made any difference? Has it changed anything? Has it somehow alerted the Israelis to the fact that clearly the world is paying attention and that it is unacceptable for there to be a famine as a result of their actions? What's been the result of that?
I mean, concrete action on the ground, whether there's been any movement, it's very hard to say. I mean, the aid quantities have not risen in any significant way. I mean, that's a fact. We've heard things, for example, from the Israeli authorities a week or so ago. They were talking about, since the lifting of the total siege on aid in May, 10,000 trucks had come in. Well, given that, if you do the mathematics on this, roughly 30 days in a month, and over the course of around 3 months, I mean, you're talking about something in the order of 100 trucks a day, which is about 1/6 of the basic survival numbers needed for the population of the Gaza Strip. So, there's no glory in that. Now, just to clarify the point about the famine, I mean, it's not so much Tom Fletcher having declared that there was a famine. What it is, it's a very lengthy process based on painstaking data gathering by people on the ground, including ourselves. We still have a network of clinics, small number rather, where we see something in the order of 11,000 patients a day, and we do malnutrition screening, notably on children. Our data was fed into an international process, a grouping of United Nations agencies, other humanitarian experts. So, the confirmation of famine, as it were, its existence, it's like confirming something which people felt was there, but then the data shows it. The warnings are that the famine could potentially spread from the Gaza City area to Deir al-Balah and indeed to the Rafah area. Now, the problem is that the data usually catches up after this has happened. So, right here, right now, it's impossible to say whether there's been a significant improvement on the malnutrition, the starvation front. But the fear is that there's not been a significant influx of aid to do anything to alleviate the impacts.
UNRWA, of course, has been continuing to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. I was just wondering if you could tell us about how and where UNRWA is making its calls. What form does that take?
I mean, public advocacy, basically, but also senior officials meeting with governments, either in open forums or the usual sort of diplomatic meetings, and through the voice of the rest of the United Nations system. And, of course, it's not just us saying this. I mean, this is the United Nations system as a collective calling for a ceasefire. It's anybody really who believes in the need for a humanitarian solution and a humanitarian point of view that is calling for this. We just need to see some kind of change. I mean, we have aid sitting in warehouses in Jordan, where I'm speaking from now. We have aid sitting in warehouses in Egypt, about 6,000 trucks worth of aid that could go in if we were allowed to bring it in. And there's aid basically there, and it's achingly close to the Gaza Strip. I mean, the Gaza Strip is, it's not an enormously long drive from Amman, and indeed Egypt, right on the border. So I mean, this stuff has to be able to go in, and the conditions have to be put in place for this to happen. It's a humanitarian perspective that needs to be paramount now.
And yet, when we put that to Israeli officials and we say to them, hold on, why are you not letting that aid in? They say, it's going to get stolen by Hamas and it won't reach the people that need it. But I mean, I don't really see much logic in that argument. What do you make of that argument?
I mean, this argument has been used over and over and over, and quite frankly, as a talking point. I mean, we've heard, from senior officials from the United States, from the previous administration, that the issue of supposed theft of aid by Hamas and other armed groups, diversion of aid, which was in public stated as a major phenomenon, the leading problem by Israeli officials, was never raised in private meetings. So, there's a disjunct between what's said in public and what's said in diplomatic settings, including, with nations which are close allies of the government of Israel. Now, that's one point. But what is it? The logic is also, the population is being starved, and this isn't a man-made disaster. This is not a natural disaster, rather. This is a man-made disaster. And that is actually quite unconscionable, basically. I mean, it's shocking in any situation that this should be allowed to happen. Particularly because it's essentially being based on a talking point that doesn't stand up to reality. Look, I mean, in any war zone, there's always confusion, and there may be armed actors, gangs, whatever, who may get hold of aid. But the point is, a United Nations-based aid distribution system, which proved its mettle during the ceasefire, as it does around the world, gets aid from A to Z into the hands of the people that need it.
Right, and this is, I'm obviously in agreement with everything you're saying, and just an extension of that is, food scarcity is clearly driving up the price of food, and therefore, if some of it is stolen by gangs and resold on the black market for exorbitant prices, I mean, that wouldn't happen if food was allowed in the quantities it was supposed to happen, it was supposed to be getting in at. So, I mean, this whole idea of bringing about the food scarcity seems to be the underlying problem here, and Israel could tackle that quite easily by letting the food in. I don't know if you make head or tail of my economics, but I'm just trying to make the point that if there was enough food, it wouldn't be such an attractive commodity to then resell.
Precisely. I mean, market economics, supply and demand apply in so many situations and so many contexts, and indeed scarcity, and indeed managed scarcity, or deliberately imposed scarcity, have had a huge impact on the situation in the Gaza Strip. Before 2024, and in 2023, with the sort of constant up and down and limited flows of aid, we saw prices going through the roof, sort of basic commodities in Gaza becoming more expensive than they would be in a place like Switzerland. You know, with an embattled, displaced population, with actually no access to cash as well, or declining access to cash. It's not like ATMs around. The cash people had in their hands was gradually turning into, sort of small pieces of paper that were gradually falling apart. So, the means to buy things, and then the huge expense, the cost of commodities, and then during the ceasefire from January to March, the bottom dropped out of this market, this black market, basically. The commodities lost their value, and it wasn't in any interest for criminal gangs to take stuff and resell it. And then, of course, what happened was during the total blockade from March to May, this spiked again. Now, there's been a bit of a dip since some aid has been coming in since May, but it's not been significant enough to do this. And so it's the quantities of aid that could also be used as a tool to make it more possible for people to actually get access to food.
And Jonathan, I mean, a lot's been happening around the world. I mean, the diplomacy, the calls, the outrage, it all continues. We've had the Pope meeting with the Israeli president. There's going to be a meeting later on this month chaired by Saudi Arabia and France. I mean, is there anything that's being done internationally that gives you a sense that perhaps there could be some light at the end of the tunnel here?
I mean, we have to hope so. I mean, the point is the ceasefire has been. I mean, we're getting close to 2 years of this war, and this is the longest within this conflict for ever, basically. And that in itself is quite a terrifying prospect. This has to end. It has to end immediately. We do have to hope that the diplomatic moves will develop the required momentum. But something has to change, and people have to make choices. And this is an enormous problem, basically.
I was just looking at the Twitter feed of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. I mean, he hasn't mentioned Gaza in his Twitter feed for 6 days. The last time he did, he said, this must stop. But I mean, some people might be wondering why he isn't turning up the temperature and maintaining that pressure. I mean, 6 days is quite a long time, isn't it?
I mean, the thing is he's also Secretary General of the United Nations, and there are many things happening around the world that require his attention. I mean, the earthquake in Afghanistan, these kind of issues. So inevitably, there may not be always the same level of visible communication about the need for a ceasefire, but we can all rest assured that the leadership across the United Nations system is fully dedicated to try to bring the ceasefire into place, to try to get this war to end. Whether or not it's talked about as visibly all the time, that just varies, to be honest. But it's clear that we're moving towards the UN General Assembly, coming, and that the tectonic plates may shift, and we just have to hope that that's the case. But, even that said, I mean, every second, every minute that is lost in talking, the time for words is over. This just has to end.
Okay. And just before we wrap up, just a quick word on what's happening in the West Bank, because, of course, UNRWA is active there. You've got schools there. Just tell us what's your understanding of what the situation is right now?
The situation in the West Bank is grim, very grim. I mean, it's been, in a sense, if we'd been having this conversation, and I think I've said this to you when we've spoken before, if we were talking in September 2023, we would have been talking about the West Bank, because already then the West Bank was in an unprecedented, or a long unprecedented situation of violence. But what we've seen since the beginning of this year is beyond anything. I mean, 30,000 people forcibly displaced from camps in the northern West Bank. The demographics are being shifted on the ground through displacement, through the bulldozing and demolition of those camps. We've had to pivot into a much more humanitarian operation than we would normally do in the West Bank. We continue to provide healthcare and schooling, but we've also needed to distribute blankets, mattresses, food, other kinds of assistance to displaced people. This is the largest wave of displacement there since the 1967 war. It's a level of violence unprecedented since the period of the Intifada. We see repeated attacks and impunity by settlers. all of this situation, and yet we continue to do what I would want to describe as our normal work. I mean, on Monday this week, around 46,000 children went back to our schools in the West Bank. Now, we were able to, for the children who've been displaced from the camps in the north, we've been doing a mixture of online education, in-person education in other structures. But I also want to emphasize that since January, under Israeli legislation, we have been banned from our operations in East Jerusalem. And as a result, they forcibly closed 6 of our schools in East Jerusalem in May, so before the academic year was over, and they've not listed that suspension. So we've got 800 children whose right to education is uncertain. I mean, the Israeli authorities have talked about the fact that the children have been able to, or their parents rather, have been able to sign them up for other schools, and they've all received a response. Now, it's interesting that it's framed that way because nobody knows if the response has been yes or no. Already in East Jerusalem, there were 2,000 missing school places for children from East Jerusalem, and they've added 800 more to those roles. So the question of the fulfillment of the right to education for these Palestinian East Jerusalemite children is a huge one. So there's many problems, of course, in the West Bank, and it's very troubling. And the evolution of the situation there is something we're watching with deep concern.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. We appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Jonathan Fowler, Senior Communications Manager at UNRWA. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, for our next segment, it is Thursday, which means we're going to get a check of the top stories in the United States this past couple of days. We can cross to Tampa, Florida, and speak to Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Makki, who joins us now. Amanda, great to have you with us. I just want to start by talking to you about a rather unusual story that seems to be doing the rounds in the United States. I mean, I won't give it all away, but the bottom line is President Trump appears to be alive and well, doesn't he?
Absolutely. Undisputable.
What's this rumor? What's this rumor about? Where did it come from?
I think there are a lot of people, as we all know, naysayers, people that just don't like President Trump, and they'll do anything to take him down. I mean, this has been kind of the story of his life for the last at least 4 years, if not longer. And the saga continues while he's in office. A lot of people are getting upset. He's ruffling a lot of feathers, and that's his prerogative. That's certainly what he campaigned on. He was not here to make friends in Washington, D.C., but rather to make sure that he does the good work of taking care of what needs to be taken care of in the government, providing transparency, getting rid of big corporate interests. And a lot of times you have people that will plant stories to make him look bad or shine him in a negative light. But there is no backing down from President Trump from everything that everyone has witnessed. Compare that to what we had with Joe Biden. In fact, Joe Biden over the weekend, we had a long weekend here in the United States with a Labor Day holiday on Monday, and they showed Joe Biden at an ice cream shop, and he was ambulating like dizzily. He couldn't really make out where he was going. He was licking an ice cream cone in a very strange way. Clearly, he was not able to really be thinking. He couldn't even answer questions. So I think when you compare someone like Joe Biden, who we saw for 4 years, really, we can't even believe that he was there doing this work, and you compare him what President Trump's been able to do, it's not even a comparison. So I think these things are just a bunch of malarkey, and I wouldn't even pay attention to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, part of the course with having a president who's, on the cusp of 80. I think he turns 80 in June next year, so that'll obviously be a big celebration, but probably get the conspiracy theories working overtime. Just one point before we move on. I mean, there was a photo, wasn't there, of President Trump's hand, some sort of a bruise on it, some sort of a marking on it. Was that, do you think, part of the source of this rumor mongering?
I'm not sure. A bruise on a hand doesn't really mean anything. This is someone who is constantly in the public eye. There are cameras wherever he goes. So, a bruising, you see that often with people, and it doesn't have anything to do with age necessarily. So I have not heard anything. There's nothing going around the rumor mills that I know of. What I see is a very spry 79-year-old who is, from what I understand, he doesn't really sleep. He gets like less than 4 hours of sleep a night, and he's just constantly working around the clock. And so I think that maybe people are jealous to see someone of that age to be able to be doing laps around people half his age.
Okay, well, let's put this story to bed once and for all. Let's take a listen to President Trump when asked about this persistent rumor earlier on in the week. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I have heard, it's sort of crazy, but last week I did numerous news conferences, all successful. They went very well, like this is going very well. And then I didn't do any for 2 days, and they said, there must be something wrong with him. Biden wouldn't do them for months. You wouldn't see him. And nobody ever said there was ever anything wrong with him, and we know he wasn't in the greatest of shape. No, I heard that. I get reports.
Okay, President Trump there. President Trump, of course, as I was saying, 79 years old. He turns 80 on the 14th of June next year. On the 15th of June next year, President Xi Jinping of China will turn 73, and also turning 73 next year will be Vladimir Putin. So those two men, about 6 years younger than President Trump. Very much in the headlines, though, this last couple of days, because we saw President Xi Jinping of China flanked by North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, and Vladimir Putin. And clearly those images of those three men did, create a bit of a stir in quite a lot of Western capitals. And I don't think President Trump seems to have appreciated seeing those three men together, did he, judging from what he put on social media? Amanda?
I think he kind of also backtracked a little bit and saying, I'm friends with all these people. I know that they like me, and this isn't really anything of a competition. I mean, if you look at where the United States is with its GDP of nearly $28 trillion, and you compare that to, China, Russia, and even India combined, these RIC nations we've been talking about since the Shanghai summit over the last week, the United States is in a league of its own, and President Trump knows that. He still has ties with Modi. Yes, they've put a 50% tariff on India, but I don't think that means that they are no longer, engaged in any kind of relationship or things that have gotten bitter. I mean, certainly Modi was one of his closest allies in his last administration. J.D. Vance, the vice president, and his Indian American wife and family visited with Modi just in February. I think the bigger issue right now for President Trump is he's trying to stop war from continuing between Ukraine and Russia. And he's doing everything, even though he doesn't have a dog in the fight. We are not in close proximity to that area. Yes, there are some in Congress that are Republicans that want to see the support for Ukraine. But the reality is that President Trump campaigned on saying, this is not my war to fight. This is not our war to fight in the United States. And so what he's trying to do is to stop the killings. That's what he wants. And if he believes that India is continuing to purchase really all that Russia has, which is oil, and is able to do that and continue to fund and perpetuate what's happening between Ukraine and Russia, he's going to try to put a lid on it. And that's what he's tried to do. He's tried to stop it. And so, again, this is not a war that President Trump campaigned on fighting. To the contrary, he did not say he was going to fight it. He just wants to see an end to it. So seeing the image, going back to the image that you're talking about, I don't know that it necessarily matters to him. He was certainly invited to go. But the bottom line is that he wants to, broker an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, and that is his goal right now.
Yeah, we've spoken to a lot of people in India in the last couple of days. I mean, a lot of them really quite angry with Washington right now. They seem to have taken this very badly, the additional tariffs, which are obviously hurting livelihoods in India. And we've also heard some people, even Republicans, who are a little bit worried that, India is not a friend that Washington can afford to lose. And, I'm just wondering if that sense of concern is reaching the White House.
I can't say for sure. I mean, certainly the Indian American community is very vibrant. They do tend to lean maybe more Republican as small business owners, just kind of aligned on those core principles of the party and of Donald Trump. Certainly, Donald Trump is someone who is pro-business. Indian Americans here are very prolific in the business community, whether it's small business or large business. You see them as CEOs and heads of companies here in the United States and abroad. So I think that does not fall on deaf ears. I think the president is aware, but sometimes you have to look at the greater good that is trying to be accomplished. And while it is important for President Trump to remain, allied with India, certainly we view them as a friend, not a foe. You have to also think of what the goal is and what President Trump is trying to accomplish. He wants India to engage and be a part of that, helping to stop the war from continuing between Ukraine and Russia. And Russia has shown its bullying tactics. Russia has shown, certainly through Putin and Medvedev, that they will move the goalpost whenever it is convenient for them. They are only talking. They are not producing. They're not doing any actions here. And so President Trump rightfully is getting frustrated, as should most anyone who doesn't want to see a war continue between these two countries.
Okay, let's move on to another story, which isn't so far away from where you are now in Tampa, Florida, just across the Caribbean Sea, a couple of thousand kilometers south, which isn't a huge distance by American standards. Something happened in the seas off Venezuela. A number of people believed to be drug traffickers were targeted by the United States, and it appears that a number of people were killed. What happened?
Well, this is a huge story in the United States because it really goes to the heart of what President Trump has been trying to do, which is, basically label these groups as, foreign terrorists, groups that are committing, horrific crimes in the United States, and that is in the form of fentanyl and the fentanyl deaths that are happening. We have heard President Trump talk ad nauseum about the fentanyl issue and the fentanyl crisis. As little as what would fit on your pinky nail that can kill people. And yet what was obtained through the seizure was in the amount of about $600 million US dollars that would have been sold on the market, the black market, if you will. And so this was a huge interception, what President Trump was able to do through the Department of Justice and Homeland Security and ICE agents, of course. And so he views this as a huge success, as do many Americans, because President Trump campaigned on keeping America safe. He's done that not only with the southern border wall, where Joe Biden left that largely open and allowing people to come through. He secured the southern border wall, and now he's doing drug interdiction, where you're not having those ingredients, those main ingredients that are required to create the methamphetamines that are then turned around and sold on our streets, and the fentanyl that's being sold on our streets. So his platform when he campaigned was on cleaning up crime and drugs. And he was able to do that in the largest seizure we've seen. So this is a huge celebration, really. I mean, if you see the social media in the United States, everyone is really giving a lot of kudos to Judge Jeanine Pirro, who's now D.C., highest D.C. lawyer for Washington, D.C. And so you're seeing a lot of praise happen for President Trump over this.
Okay, and just lastly, Amanda, another story that is also quite close to where you are right now. It's actually in the same state as where you are right now. Florida, on track, it would appear, to ban vaccine mandates for school children. What are people saying about this?
So I always want to preface this, because I've gotten so many phone calls since last night about this, that this does require the legislature to act on things that are enacted in law. So there are some vaccines that have been done by executive order, and then some that are in law, in statute. And so those have to actually be undone by the legislature. So that is not happening like tomorrow, like some people want it to. To that point, I think there are a lot of people that believe that that, for example, if you're in your 40s and you were given immunizations, vaccinations in the 80s, what does that schedule look like as compared to what your children are getting today? There are certainly some, like measles, mumps, rubella, those types of vaccines that can be spread easily. So a lot of people are worried about, what does that mean for my children being in schools with kids that have not been vaccinated? And what does that ultimately mean for the safety of my child? But there are certainly some vaccines that that are required to give boosters to children, and they do not have herd issues with that. They do not spread. So there does have to be certainly transparency in this process, and really looking and seeing, we are going to look as mothers to who is it that we are going to get guidance from on what our children need. But I will say, in the state of Florida, the free state of Florida, you had a lot of people who moved here 2020 and subsequent to the 2020 and years after that moved here for that very freedom to not have to be given COVID vaccines and to escape those states, especially in the Northeast and out West. The Pacific Northwest, I should say, they don't want to be subject to being told what to do. They want more medical transparency. They want more autonomy in their medical decisions. But I do think it causes some concerns for mothers who want to know, well, what is it that I do need to have my children get? But then the state is saying, we're leaving it up to you to decide what is best for you and your child. And for a lot of people, that is very liberating. And that is what they want out of this governor and out of this Republican administration in Florida.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for helping us make sense of four interesting stories in very little time. Amanda Makki, Republican strategist. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at some of the best interviews of the week. Until then, bye-bye.